I had always known my Aunt Vivian to be a meticulous woman. She kept her life in rigid order, her accounts balanced to the last penny, her possessions labeled and categorized with almost obsessive precision. She was the type to plan for every eventuality, to anticipate every problem before it arose. But I never thought she would use that control against me. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning. I was sitting at my desk at work, sipping my usual lukewarm coffee, when my phone buzzed with a message from my bank. Transaction declined. My heart skipped a beat. That didn't make sense. I had just been paid last week, and I knew I had enough to cover the loan payment. I logged into my banking app, expecting to see some minor issue, maybe a hold or a pending transaction. But what I saw made my blood run cold. My account was frozen. No withdrawals, no transfers, nothing. A red banner on the screen confirmed it: account blocked, administrator hold. Administrator? Who could have? Then it hit me. Aunt Vivian. I felt a rush of anger mixed with disbelief. She had access to my account, not because I had ever given it to her directly, but because, years ago, when I was struggling financially, she had co-signed on a joint account to help me secure a loan. It was meant to be a safeguard, a family gesture of trust. I had promised to be responsible, and I had been. So why would she do this now? I grabbed my phone and called her. The line rang 3 times before she answered, her voice as cool as ever. "Hello, dear," she said, as if nothing was wrong. "Aunt Vivian," I tried to keep my voice steady, "my account is blocked." "Did you?" "Yes," she interrupted smoothly. "I did." A pause. I was too stunned to speak. "I had to," she continued, her tone firm but not unkind. "I saw that you were about to make a very poor decision, and I couldn't, in good conscience, let you go through with it." I gripped my phone tighter. "A poor decision? Paying off my loan is a poor decision?" She sighed, as if I were a child who didn't understand the simplest of lessons. "Paying it off prematurely is. You should be investing that money elsewhere, not throwing it all away on a debt that isn't even urgent." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Vivian, I'm in charge of my own finances. You had no right to do this." "I had every right," she countered. "As a co-signer, I have a say in what happens with that account. You were rushing into something without considering the consequences." I simply intervened. Rage burned in my chest, but beneath it was something worse, the sinking realization that she truly believed she was doing the right thing. I took a deep breath. "You need to undo this. Today." "I'm afraid I can't," she said, her voice final. "Not yet, anyway. We need to have a proper discussion first. Face to face." She was toying with me. And I wasn't going to let it go. As I ended the call, one thought crystallized in my mind: she had underestimated me. And that was a mistake she would regret. I left work early, my mind a storm of thoughts as I drove across town to Aunt Vivian's house. She lived in a stately old home, the kind with a perfectly manicured lawn and a front door that looked like it had never been slammed in frustration. Everything about her life was neat, measured, and controlled. She had always been like that. When I was a kid, she was the aunt who insisted on wiping my hands before I touched anything in her house. The one who believed in teaching lessons rather than simply helping. This, apparently, was one of those lessons. I parked in the driveway and took a deep breath before stepping out. No matter how angry I was, I needed to keep my composure. Losing my temper wouldn't get my account unlocked any faster. The door opened before I even knocked. She had been waiting. "Come in, dear," she said smoothly, stepping aside. She wore one of her usual neatly pressed blouses, her silver hair pulled back in a perfect bun. She didn't look like someone who had just turned my life upside down. She looked like someone who had just baked a pie. I walked in and went straight to the living room, ignoring the offer of tea she was already preparing. Let's just get to it, Vivian. Why did you really block my account? She sighed and sat down across from me, folding her hands neatly in her lap. I told you. You were about to make a mistake. Paying off a loan is not a mistake, I snapped. It is when it leaves you vulnerable, she said, tilting her head slightly. You're not thinking long-term, dear. If you use all your savings now, what happens if you suddenly lose your job? Or have an emergency? You'll be scrambling for money. I shook my head, barely able to believe this. That's my choice to make, not yours. Not when I'm the co-signer, she said calmly. I exhaled sharply. Then remove yourself from the account. Right now. She raised an eyebrow, as if I had just suggested something ridiculous. I don't think that would be wise. Wise? I let out a bitter laugh. You don't want me to pay off my loan, but you also refuse to remove yourself from my finances? Do you even hear how controlling that sounds? Vivian remained infuriatingly composed. Control is only a problem when it's used irresponsibly. And what exactly do you think I was going to do? I asked, crossing my arms. She hesitated. Just for a second. But it was enough. She wasn't telling me everything. You're hiding something, I said slowly. This isn't just about the loan, is it? For the first time, a flicker of discomfort crossed her face. I am protecting you. I leaned forward, my voice low. From what, Vivian? She didn't answer. Instead, she stood up, smoothed the front of her blouse, and said, We'll discuss it more over dinner. I've made a roast. Unbelievable. I had come here expecting a simple argument over money. But now, something else was going on, something she wasn't telling me. I wasn't just going to sit around and eat roast while she kept me in the dark. I was going to find out what she was hiding. Dinner at Aunt Vivian's house had always been a carefully orchestrated event. The table was always set perfectly, the meal meticulously prepared, and the conversation steered with precision. Tonight was no different, except that I wasn't in the mood to play along. The aroma of roasted meat and herbs filled the air as she carried a perfectly plated dish to the table, acting as if we hadn't just had a major argument. I sat across from her, my appetite buried beneath my frustration. She picked up her knife and fork and smiled. Eat, dear. You'll think clearer on a full stomach. I didn't touch my plate. I'm not here for dinner, Vivian. I'm here for answers. She took a slow, deliberate bite before finally speaking. You've always been impulsive. You make decisions based on emotion rather than logic. That's why I had to intervene. I clenched my jaw. Stop talking in circles. What aren't you telling me? She dabbed her lips with a napkin and exhaled softly. All right. Since you insist. She set her utensils down and looked at me, her sharp eyes calculating. Did you know your loan is connected to an investment fund? I frowned. What? I took the liberty of reviewing the details, she continued. The bank structured your loan so that if you paid it off early, they would redirect the remaining interest payments into an investment fund. I stared at her. Why would they do that? Because someone set it up that way, she said, folding her hands. Someone with access to your financial details. And before you ask, it wasn't me. A chill ran down my spine. Then who was it? She took a sip of her wine, watching me over the rim of her glass. That's what we need to find out. My mind was spinning. I had applied for this loan through normal channels. No hidden tricks, no shady deals. Or so I had thought. But now, Aunt Vivian was telling me that someone had tampered with it, redirecting money to an account I knew nothing about. And I had almost paid it off blindly. I sat back in my chair, my appetite gone completely. How did you find out? Vivian smirked. You think you're the only one who keeps an eye on things? I may be controlling, dear, but at least I do my homework. I hated to admit it, but she had just saved me from walking straight into a trap. But that raised an even bigger question: who had said it? And why? I looked at her, my frustration now mixed with wariness. What do we do next? She smiled, her expression oddly pleased. Now, dear, we do things my way. I wasn't sure which unsettled me more, the fact that my aunt had blocked my account, or the fact that she had been right to do it. Someone had tampered with my loan, and I had almost walked straight into their trap. But who? Vivian took her time finishing her meal, while I sat there, my mind racing. When she finally set her fork down, she looked at me expectantly. Shall we? She led me to her study, a room that was as meticulously arranged as the rest of her house. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with neatly labeled binders and leather-bound financial records. A large desk stood in the center, where she motioned for me to sit. She pulled open a drawer and retrieved a thin folder, placing it in front of me. Here's what I found. I opened it and scanned the documents inside. Statements from my bank, pages of loan agreements, and a printout of a transaction history I had never seen before. There, buried in the fine print, was the clause. Upon early repayment, outstanding interest funds will be transferred to investment account #8093XL. An account that wasn't mine. I felt my stomach tighten. This isn't a standard banking policy, is it? Vivian shook her head. No, dear. This was added after you signed your loan agreement. I looked up at her. After? She nodded. Someone modified your terms after the fact. That's illegal, of course, but most people never check. You were supposed to be one of those people. I exhaled sharply, the realization settling over me like a weight. So if I had paid off my loan early, the money wouldn't have gone to the bank. It would have gone to whoever owns that account, she finished. I clenched my fists. And the bank let this happen? Vivian sighed, tapping a manicured nail against the desk. Banks process thousands of transactions a day. Do you really think they double-check every single amendment? No, dear. This was done by someone who knew exactly how to slip it through without raising red flags. I swallowed hard. Do we know who owns the account? Vivian's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. Not yet. But I have a contact at the bank. Of course she did. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number, putting it on speaker. After a few rings, a deep voice answered. This is Mark. Mark, dear, it's Vivian. There was a pause, then a quiet chuckle. Vivian. Didn't expect to hear from you again so soon. I raised an eyebrow. Again? Vivian ignored my questioning look. I need a favor, she said smoothly. I need to know who owns an investment account. Mark sighed. You know I can't just hand over that kind of information. Vivian leaned back, her tone turning almost playful. Oh, Mark. I'm sure we can work something out. Another pause. Then, give me the number. I watched as she rattled off the account number from the documents. Mark hummed thoughtfully. All right. Give me a few hours. Vivian smiled. Knew I could count on you. The call ended, and she turned to me with a triumphant look. Now we wait. I exhaled slowly, still trying to process everything. You've done this before, haven't you? She simply smiled. For the first time in my life, I realized something unsettling. My aunt wasn't just meticulous. She was dangerous. The hours dragged on. I tried to distract myself, but my mind kept circling back to the same thought: who had done this to me? Vivian, on the other hand, was the picture of patience. She sat in her study, calmly reading a novel while I paced the room. Every now and then, she'd glance up and smirk. "Do sit down, dear," she said finally. "You'll wear a hole in my carpet." Before I could reply, her phone buzzed. She picked it up, put it on speaker, and Mark's voice filled the room. "You're not going to like this," he said. Vivian raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Try me." There was a brief hesitation before he spoke again. "The account is registered to Philip Carter." I stopped pacing. My blood turned cold. Philip Carter. My loan officer. The man who had personally assured me my contract was standard and that everything was above board. The same man who had encouraged me to pay it off early, praising me for being financially responsible. He had been setting me up. I gritted my teeth. That lying, I caught myself before I said something I'd regret. He stole from me. Vivian leaned back, unimpressed. "No, dear. He tried to steal from you. And if I hadn't intervened, he would have succeeded." I clenched my fists. "I have to go to the police." Mark sighed on the other end of the line. "That's tricky. If he's careful, there won't be a direct link between him and the account. He might have set it up under a shell company or used a proxy." Vivian nodded. "Besides, confronting him now might make him cover his tracks." I exhaled sharply, trying to think. "Then what do we do?" Vivian smiled, a slow, dangerous smile. "Simple," she said. "We make him think he's won." I frowned. "How?" She picked up her phone and started typing. "You're going to call Philip tomorrow and tell him you're moving forward with paying off the loan." My heart pounded. "But won't that?" She held up a hand. "Let him believe his little scheme is working. Let him lower his guard." I swallowed hard. "And then?" Her smile widened. "Then, dear, we set a trap." The next morning, I sat in my car, gripping my phone. Vivian's plan was simple: make Philip believe I was going through with the payment, let him lower his guard, and then catch him in the act. I exhaled and dialed his number. Philip answered on the second ring. "Philip Carter speaking." I forced an easygoing tone. "Hey, Philip, it's me. Just wanted to let you know, I've decided to move forward with paying off the loan early." A brief pause. Then, his voice turned warm, almost too warm. "That's great news. Really smart move, getting ahead of that interest." I could almost hear his grin. He thought he'd won. "Yeah," I continued, playing along. "Just wanted to check, do I need to do anything special to process it?" "Nope," he said smoothly. "Just initiate it through your online banking, and it'll go straight through." I forced a chuckle. "Perfect. Thanks for all your help, Philip." "Anytime," he replied, his voice dripping with satisfaction. I hung up and immediately called Vivian. "He bought it," I said. She hummed in approval. "Of course he did. Now, dear, we wait for him to make his move. And when he did, we'd be ready." Vivian wasted no time. The moment I confirmed that Philip had taken the bait, she made another call to Mark, her bank contact. "Keep an eye on that investment account," she instructed. "The moment money moves, I want to know." Meanwhile, I had my own task. I went to the bank in person, acting as if I were finalizing the early repayment. But instead of actually transferring the money, I requested an official confirmation document, one that looked like the transaction had been processed. Philip wouldn't know the difference. By the time I got back to my car, my phone buzzed. It was Mark. "He just moved a large sum out of that account," he said. "Looks like he's trying to hide it." I clenched my jaw. "So we have him?" Vivian's voice came through, calm and confident. "Almost, dear. Now, we need to make him panic." I frowned. How do we do that? She chuckled. Simple. We let him think the bank is onto him. And with that, the real game began. Philip thought he had gotten away with it. He had moved the money, convinced his scheme had gone unnoticed. But what he didn't know was that we had been watching him the entire time. Now, it was time to push him into making a mistake. Vivian leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers against the desk. We need him nervous, she said. If he feels safe, he'll take his time covering his tracks. But if he thinks the bank is investigating, he'll panic, and that's when people make mistakes. I frowned. How do we do that? She smirked. We give him a reason to worry. Vivian sent a message to Mark, and within minutes, he responded with an official-looking memo from the bank's internal audit team. The wording was vague but effective. It announced a review of recent loan modifications to ensure compliance with company policies. It was addressed to all loan officers, giving the impression that it was routine. But for someone like Philip, who had knowingly altered my loan terms, just seeing that memo would be enough to shake him. I wasn't sure it would be enough. Philip was careful, and he had been smooth through this whole process. But Vivian wasn't done yet. That afternoon, I went to the bank like any other customer. I made sure Philip saw me, giving him a casual nod and a thumbs up as if everything was normal. He grinned back, his usual confidence intact, still believing his plan was working. He had no idea that, at that very moment, Vivian was sending an anonymous tip to the bank's fraud department. The message was short but effective: check recent modifications on loan agreements handled by Philip Carter. Specifically, compare the original contracts with the final terms. You'll find something interesting. It was just enough to plant the seed of suspicion. No names, no accusations, just the right kind of nudge to make sure the bank started looking where Philip didn't want them to. By the next morning, the cracks in his composure had already started to show. Mark texted me, "Philip's been acting weird all day. Keeps checking his computer like he's expecting something. Also, he had a meeting with his supervisor, looked tense when he walked out." I showed Vivian the message, and she nodded approvingly. He knows something's coming. He just doesn't know what. I watched Philip from a distance the next time I visited the bank. He was still smiling, still acting normal, but there was something off. He was fidgety. Distracted. The confident, smooth-talking man who had reassured me about my loan now looked like someone who had just realized the ground beneath him wasn't as solid as he thought. That evening, Mark called again. This time, his voice was excited. "Philip just made a big mistake," he said. He tried to access restricted files in the system, stuff he had no clearance for. IT flagged it immediately. Looks like he was trying to check if anyone was looking into his past transactions. I felt my pulse quicken. That's it. That's what we needed. Vivian gave me a knowing smile. He just proved he's hiding something. And now, the bank has a reason to dig deeper. We had him. But we weren't done yet. Philip thought he could manipulate the system without consequences. He thought he was untouchable. It was time to show him just how wrong he was. Philip was running out of time, and he knew it. The moment IT flagged his unauthorized access attempt, the bank's fraud department started paying attention. It was no longer just an internal audit. Now, there was a clear reason to investigate him. The walls were closing in. I stopped by the bank the next day under the guise of handling my repayment process. Philip was still at his desk, but he looked different. The confidence he usually carried had been replaced with something else: discomfort. His eyes flickered toward his computer screen every few seconds, and his smile felt forced. As I approached, I could see him trying to mask his anxiety. "Hey, good to see you," he said, his voice as smooth as ever. "Everything still good on your end?" I nodded, playing along. "Yeah, just wanted to double-check that the loan repayment is all set." He swallowed slightly before nodding. Of course, of course. No issues at all." He was lying through his teeth. I leaned on the counter, lowering my voice just enough to make it seem casual. "You seem stressed, Philip. Something wrong?" For a brief second, something flickered in his expression, paranoia, maybe. But he quickly forced a chuckle. "No, not at all. Just a busy day. Busy scrambling to cover his tracks, more like." That afternoon, Mark called with the news we had been waiting for. "The fraud department's officially investigating Philip. They've already pulled his records. They're seeing the discrepancies." I exhaled. How long until they confront him? "Could be a few days, but here's the interesting part," Mark said. "He's already moving his money around. He withdrew a large sum this morning. Looks like he's trying to relocate funds before they freeze his accounts." Vivian smirked when I told her. Classic behavior. He's preparing for an exit. I frowned. So he might just disappear? Not if we make sure he doesn't have the chance. Vivian made one last call. This time, it wasn't to Mark. It was to a reporter. She had connections everywhere, and within hours, a local journalist was tipped off about the potential financial misconduct under internal review at the bank. No names were mentioned, but the story was enough to ensure the bank would be under public scrutiny. If Philip thought he could quietly sneak away, he was about to learn otherwise. The next morning, everything unraveled. I arrived at the bank just in time to see Philip being led into his supervisor's office. He looked pale. Mark messaged me a minute later. They confronted him. He's denying everything, but they have the records. 15 minutes later, Philip walked out, his face grim, his hands clenched into fists. I watched as he grabbed his coat and exited the building without a word to anyone. Another message from Mark came through. He's suspended indefinitely. They're handing everything over to legal. It was over. I turned to leave, but not before catching Philip's eye from across the parking lot. For a brief second, his expression shifted, anger, resentment. He knew. He didn't know how, but he knew someone had played him. I smiled, gave him a small nod, and walked away. When I got to my car, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was Vivian. "It's done, dear." I exhaled, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. "It's done." "Good," she said, sounding pleased. "Now, let's celebrate." And for once, I didn't mind letting her take control. With Philip gone, I finally had control over my finances again. But something still felt off. He hadn't acted alone. Vivian, as always, was ahead of me. "We didn't just take down Philip," she said over dinner. "We rattled the whole branch." She was right. That night, Mark texted me. "Philip's boss is under investigation. They found more altered loans." A week later, another message, "His manager just resigned." I stared at my phone, realizing how far this had gone. What started as a simple loan had uncovered something much bigger. And none of it would have happened without Vivian. I walked into her house, smirking. "We won." She closed her book with a satisfied smile. "Of course we did." And I was very, very glad she was on my side. The end.